You wrote a book about Cayman, but actually it's like transferring wealth, ownership, and responsibility from place to place, from little offshore to bigger offshore to onshore again,
Yeah.
and again through like this kind of rhizome in a way, right? So we see like the companies today are basically like a network structured as network. So can you just like explain a little bit about this idea of network, because
Yeah.
I like the shape in a way, you know, how a company is structured today.
I'll give you an example of a company that I'm looking at the moment. It's a Russian business in agriculture. So it owns land, and on that land it's maybe farming. Then all these parcels of land are all wrapped up and owned by a Cyprus company, call it Cyprus Finance Co. And then that company is owned by a Luxembourg company called Luxembourg Refinance Co. And then above this, there's another Cyprus company. And above that, there are 4 Belize companies. And above that are the actual owners. So you see the way this company, it's just farming. It looks to you and me, if you were there, it was just farming. But that farming, that real world onshore activity, has been networked, mediated through all these different levels, all these networks of tax havens, all these networks of tax exchange agreements. There are 2 reasons for why a company is doing that. One is for the tax reasons. That's a huge part of it. So it can avoid or evade tax. It doesn't have to pay the tax in the country where these farms are. The profits, the dividends get taken offshore. But once you've taken away your profits and you've mitigated the tax as far as possible, then you've got to hold on to your money. So you make as much as you can without it being taxed. And then of course the trick is to hold on to it. So that's what you see being networked through in these structures. You see tax optimization, it's politely called by lawyers at the beginning, and then as it goes up, the reign of possession over this wealth that's been made by the people who own this company gets tighter and tighter and tighter. So when it reaches some offshore tax haven in Belize, and maybe that is held by a trust that's in Jersey, and that trust is then held by a trust somewhere else, and then that by another company, that money, that wealth is secured away. That wealth, which in many ways is wealth that's been stolen. If I infer from the work that I do, which is looking at companies across the world and how they are structured, and how they are by and large structured through offshore networks, pretty much exclusively how they're structured, then I can infer from that that the global economy is going to be made up of companies that are structured in this way through offshore tax havens, and that therefore the global economy has a huge offshore dimension to it. Because if the companies that are operating in that economy are all held and structured offshore, then the economy, the global economy, is an offshore economy. If you want to look at how structural offshore is to the global economy, look at the things that the offshore world facilitates that are structural to our world. We have money laundering, corruption, poverty, aid dependence, weak governance, bad business practices, hidden interests hiding behind offshore fronts, monopolies, debt. There's a huge offshore dimension to debt, the hiding away of debt. It's not just hiding away wealth, it's hiding away debt as well. There must be transparency about where money is, who owns it, where it's structured, who's owed what, who's opening a company, who owns a company. Why not? I mean, why should it be secret? Why should it be secret? Give me a good reason why your company should be secret. Your ownership of your company should be secret unless you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. What I've called the magic ring of secrecy from the gods and demigods of capitalism. Just take it away from them. What happens then? Then you begin to make finance, money, wealth, capitalism accountable to the public. Accountable. You can see it, you can check it out, you can look into it. It's not just out there in this parallel secret universe evading any kind of accountability.
By researching on this project, I find out that there are, this agency that you can actually write an email or like fill a form online and actually open a company wherever you want, just by filling a form online on a website. So
This is true.
Yeah,
that is true.
I wondered if that is giving more opportunity to who want to avoid tax or like using offshore tricks.
But if you want to evade surveillance or the eyes of the state or the public gaze or oversight, if you want to find a jurisdiction where you can get away with stuff and not have people seeing what you're doing, and that's a part of human nature, isn't it? Trying to get away with stuff. You will have there ready to hand on a click of the mouse, if you have them anymore. I don't think you do, but on your, tell me what it is. You can set up a company wherever you like for hardly anything online, and you could launder money through it that you'd stolen tomorrow, today, in the next 10 minutes.
Ordinary people has to pay more because the wealthy of the company don't pay anything. That is the point for me. I mean, it's not that everyone has to pay taxes. It's not a moral issue for me. It's more really ethical in a way. Why people has to pay for the companies, when the companies actually took advantage of all the infrastructure made by the money of the taxpayer.
Yeah, that's the unaccountability. That's the remoteness of the offshore aspect of these companies, where you may own something somewhere, but then you don't have any commitment to where that thing is that you own. Right. So the society in which where that thing is, you've just escaped offshore, but you've taken advantage of the laws and the regulations and the labour and everything where your asset is, but you don't want any of the responsibility of anything wider than purely just your asset. And if you think about that, the way that, that's, say you own a factory, you could be like that with a factory, but if you look at what happened in the world that led up to the financial crisis, is that there was all this financial intermediation. There were all these financial products which were structured, some offshore, some onshore. Yeah. So there's no responsibility. The connection between, the real asset and the people who owned them was completely broken up. Yeah. Because it was all through this, hall of mirrors, and no one still now doesn't know. It's a business like any other. That any country is probably happy to get in the world that we live in. People will look to, governments will look to invest in industries that are going to attract investment from outside. If you're a small island economy and you have no industry, no agriculture, what do you offer? You offer what you might call sweets. You act like a sweet shop in the global economy, in the financial system, where you can invent new varieties and new flavours. And offshore centres like Cayman, for example, have led the way in developing so many different kinds of offshore instruments over the years. And it's, it keeps the economy, the Cayman Authority afloat. The people who live in Cayman, who work in this sector, they get well paid for it. Someone controlling the network it's just not like that. These are relatively autonomous parts of a network, So it's very, no one is controlling it or, you know, dictating how it is. It's a kind of almost an organic, nature-like phenomenon.
There are though some international law that can, you know, tackle the problem or like force regulate these kind of practices. Do you believe in that?
Well, yes. I mean, you've got to believe. Yeah, in principle. I mean, look, you know, the UN has sanctions against, you know, countries doing all sorts of things. The EU has sanctions. The US has sanctions about arms trading, for example. But some countries and some companies blatantly break US and EU sanctions to do with arms trading, for example. But it depends on what's going on, what the bigger picture is, what's at stake. I mean, yes, you need to have principles and multilateral agreements, but that's different from the real world where, you know, not everyone agrees, not everyone wants the same thing. People have different interests. You know, this will be like the offshore tax haven world will be like these global issues like arms trading or things which are downright, obviously dangerous. But they happen. They're not illegal in many parts of the world. They're contested, fought over ad nauseum, and that's the way that it works. There's been a lot of talk at the moment about politicians, senior politicians, revealing their tax affairs. And David Cameron and the rest of the Conservative government have said that they're happy to do that. Now, it's interesting, we hear reported in the Guardian that David Cameron's father set up offshore structures in the early 1980s. He set up an investment fund in Panama in 1982 when David Cameron was 16 at Eton School. So I think this is the deeper story behind that. If you looked at, you know, David Cameron's tax return, it would probably look fine. But behind it is this offshore story that his father was involved in moving money offshore when that was allowed under the Thatcher government. So David Cameron is like he's like the child of this. He's an offshore child. He's that generation which has profited from the deregulation and liberalisation of capital that happened in the 1980s. That wasn't allowed before. And this is the man who is our Prime Minister today in a government that is telling us all the time about the evils of tax avoidance and how they're going to crack down on it. He comes from a class, it's when the City of London were finally able to take their money and run and set up offshore wealth vehicles. It's nothing wrong. I mean, as far as we can see, there's nothing illegal about what he did. It's perfectly legal. Everyone did it. But it's more of a cultural, historical shift that happened in the early 1980s, when the City of London thought, wow, we can fly offshore now. We can let it rip. And he's grown up. Now, that's his background. That's his cultural, social background, that offshore class. And someone for whom the offshore world is as natural as Sunday dinner around the kitchen table at his family home. I'm the same age as Cameron. I had a very privileged education myself, not at Eton, but somewhere else. When I was, younger, my parents, my family weren't putting their wealth offshore. In fact, my stepfather was the governor of the Bank of Scotland. And you couldn't have imagined a more of a staid banking institution than the Bank of Scotland as it used to be. But then, starting from the early 2000s, like a lot of old banking institutions, which by and large were connected to their communities, they were onshore banking institutions, got corrupted by that offshore culture, that running away with your money and setting up funds here and there in Panama. And that Bank of Scotland that I remember from my youth got changed into this vehicle of spivs and double dealers and wanting to expand, and then the whole thing fell apart, along with a lot of other banks in this country, and had to be bailed out by the government.